today it's my great honor to invite Sebastian Strangio, and he's a journalist, an author, an analyst focusing on Southeast Asia. And since 2008, his writing from the region has appeared in Foreign Policy, New York Times, The New Republic, Forbes, and any other major outlets. And in addition to his journalism, Sebastian has become a leading commentator on politics in Cambodia and Vietnam. And his views have been quoted by major media outlets. And of course, that we know that recently he came out with a brand new book, and I happened to read that book, which I strongly recommend everyone to check out. The book is titled In the Dragon's Shadow, Southeast Asia in the Chinese Century. Sebastian, welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thanks for having me.
You know, as we mentioned before in the intro, right now the tension or even the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, it's getting more intense every day. You know, the whole world is watching. And meanwhile, I think China, has become one of the major important players in terms of understanding, or maybe the international community is hoping that China can play a significant role in this conflict. So from your perspective, again, you cover countries in Southeast Asia and you understand this political tension or ties between China and the other countries. Why do you think that in the midst of the whole chaos between Russia and Ukraine, China plays such an important role for this?
Well, you'll remember that during, in the early stages of the Beijing Winter Olympics on February the 4th, Chinese President Xi Jinping and his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, met in Beijing, and they issued, a statement, which promised to raise the strategic partnership between China and Russia to a new level. It was described as a partnership with no limits. And then, the day, barely days after the closing ceremony of the Beijing Olympics, Putin sends in the Russian military into eastern Ukraine and begins, a war of conquest against a sovereign state. So the question of what China's role has been and how much support China is offering to the Russians in this venture has been a subject of hot, considerable debate. How much did she know about the likelihood of a war? Obviously, we all knew that there was tensions brewing between Russia and Ukraine, and that that there were troops massed on the border. But it was, many people failed to predict that he would actually go through with this invasion. A lot of people thought it would be against his political interests, that it was an insane gamble that couldn't possibly win out, given the galvanizing effect that it would likely have and has indeed had among the Western democracies. So the question is, was China duped? Was it misled by the Russian government of Vladimir Putin into sort of providing this, putting its signature on this sort of like new pact with Russia prior to the invasion? And I think that the Chinese right now are facing a very tricky diplomatic situation. On the one hand, they see a lot of benefits in their strategic relationship with Russia, particularly given the broader context of hostility with the United States. In many ways, U.S. policy, I think, has pushed Russia and China closer together and made them see, focus on areas of shared interest rather than areas of friction, of which there are many in the Russia-China relationship. On the other hand, China also, and Chinese diplomats constantly harp on this. China's foreign policy is built around the principle of national sovereignty and the norm of non-intervention. So faced with, the armed aggression against a sovereign nation by a nation with which China is a loose strategic partner, the government has been forced to dance between these two imperatives. And so we've seen, very sort of vague statements, expressing concern about the situation and calling for dialogue, reaffirming China's support for the norm of national sovereignty, but also sort of focusing on the responsibility that the United States and the West has played in bringing about this conflict. So China's in a very difficult situation. But I also think it's a mistake to see China as wholly in support of the Russian action. And in the West right now, we see a real polarization. We see a lot of Western nations saying, you're with us or against us.
That's right.
You're either, on the side of sort of you're against the invasion of Ukraine, or you're in support of it. And there's really no daylight between those 2 points. And this is also, been a challenge for the Indian government, which has been pressed by its Quad partners to sort of come out and, join this Western front of opposition toward the Russian government. But this is something that most nations in the global South have resisted. And India, of course, is always a very interesting bellwether for the developing world and how it approaches these sorts of superpower conflicts. And the Indians are stubbornly hewing to sort of their non-aligned and independent foreign policy.
That's right.
I'm no expert in Indian foreign policy, but it's certainly a tendency that they tend to view things in sort of a less starkly ideological way than some of their Western partners are doing at the moment, or have had a tendency to do recently. And so China's, caught in a similar situation. I think that they are loath to wholly condemn the Russians because they feel like there's an important strategic partnership that they don't want to forswear. But at the same time, China has spent the last 2 or 3 decades trumpeting the norm of national sovereignty and criticizing Western governments when they violate that norm, and making the claim that China respects it and that China as a superpower will be more cooperative and more respectful of at least the formal sovereignty of small nations. That is now on the line, and I think that China's wavering is something that will be very interesting to watch in the weeks and months to come. But I think it's worth emphasizing that we really are in the early stages of this crisis. We're barely 2 weeks into the invasion. This is a campaign that could go on for months. And if it does lead to the armed occupation and installation of a puppet regime in Kiev, we could end up seeing, Russia bogged down in Ukraine for many years, given the likely insurgency that would spring up to resist it. So, I think that, China's position is probably likely to evolve, and we should probably, bear that in mind when we assess what it's doing currently.
Sebastian, it's interesting that we know that the military side in China has grown tremendously. And in the past few decades, and I'm sure that you also mentioned in your book, China's military power at this moment in the year of 2022, even last year, that has shown this tremendous potential and has become a major threat, especially to the West. So in other words, in China today, the government intentionally try to grow this military power and try to let the world to understand that what the military power stands for. And this is something that could easily terrify the Western culture, the Western hemisphere. But meanwhile, my question to you is, let's say if U.S. is either intentionally or unintentionally pushing Russia and China work closely, especially in terms of political or military collaboration, don't you think this is a very dangerous path? So in other words, why do you think that U.S. is doing this? Meanwhile, they know that these two countries today are in this, what I called, untouchable phase.
Well, I do think that it's potentially dangerous. The basic principle of strategy is that you try to create tensions between your adversaries. And at the moment, the tenor of a lot of American policy and Western policy, in rhetoric, if not in substance, has been to emphasize that Russia and China are partners in a sort of new axis of autocracy, or as the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison put it in a speech yesterday, an arc of autocracy. And that basically these powers are, represent a monolithic block of authoritarianism, and that they seek to sort of reshape the world order in order to make it, more, to reflect their own image, which is again, the phrase that Morrison used yesterday. I think that, focusing on the ideological, commonalities between Russia and China and ignoring the vast differences of strategic interest between the two countries, also ignoring and overlooking the vast difference in the way that the two political systems in these countries, undemocratic as they are, operate. There's really no comparison between the mafia state of Vladimir Putin and the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, which is much more structured and hierarchical and institutionalized. I think that the West is running a risk of incentivizing the Russians and Chinese to look at all of the interests that they do share. And I think that this ideological framing will only succeed in pushing them together. And that would be dangerous, because an alliance between the Chinese and the Russians, could well, it's they're much stronger together. Now, one could ask the question of whether, the inherent tensions between Russia and China, will prevent such a close alliance from forming. And I think you could probably, the invasion of Ukraine highlights some of those points of tension. So perhaps, they're never going to become sort of like totally comfortable allies. I think that Vladimir Putin's adventurism in Ukraine is something that the Chinese probably are a little bit annoyed about, given that they made this big commitment to Russia, and sort of such a reckless gamble on the part of Putin is something that now China is sort of being associated with in the eyes of many countries around the world. And again, as I said before, put them in a very difficult situation. But I do think that, the West should be trying to incentivize these two countries, should be trying to widen the gap between them rather than pressing them together. And I think that, one good, example is the fact that Western leaders, including senior officials in the European Union, and again, the Australian Prime Minister yesterday, they've come out and called on China to sort of put, to lean on Putin to sort of withdraw his troops and end the war in Ukraine. But this comes after, years in which China has been sort of described as this sort of, enemy and adversary of the West, and as a country that is, hell bent on sort of exporting repression around the world. And so sort of, the request for Chinese assistance in this, sort of jars with that, basically, if you're going to express that sort of hostility for years, you can't expect the Chinese are going to sort of turn around and do you a favor when you need one. And I think that that's, there needs to be more of an awareness that, that China could be a useful partner in isolating and containing, this spoiler state that is led by Vladimir Putin. But instead, Western policies have contributed to, and of course the Chinese themselves, their perceptions obviously play a big role here in their own actions and their own decisions. But Western policy is sort of, has sent the message that, the West, a lot of Western governments see China as an adversary, and therefore, that China needs to find partners that share, similar threat perception. And of course, Russia is one of those. And so, it's hard to, treat China that way, and then also to expect it to help when help is required. And so, that's just one example of sort of the cul-de-sac into which I think Western policy toward these two countries has sort of retreated over the past several years.
Sebastian, if I'm sure that you also remember, back in the days during the Trump administration, the tension between North Korea and U.S. was in this unpredictable position. And both leaders, they exchange, in words or in written letters, and the conversation or the tension became so high, and they began to threaten each other. And this time, China stepped in. And then China played a critical role and to smooth out the tension. Again, we don't know what happened behind the doors, but eventually that in terms of controlling or in terms of reducing the tension, China actually played a critical role in terms of managing North Korea. Now, but at this time, this is something quite interesting. The tension or the relationship between U.S. and China today, it's not getting any better. Let's just be honest. And meanwhile, the relation between Russia and U.S. is also on the brink of collapse. So in other words, why do you think the U.S. is taking this risk, not to heal the relationship with the both partners? And meanwhile, U.S. is, I don't want to use the word intentional, but it's somehow is doing the counter favor and not really bring the relationship together and not playing this mediator, but meanwhile, and trying to trigger or trying to provoke both countries to become angry, to become agitated towards the West. Why is U.S. doing this?
Well, I think that it's become a bipartisan consensus in the United States that the greatest strategic challenge facing the U.S. is China. I think that perception underpinned the withdrawal of the U.S. from Afghanistan last August. I think that it continues to be the primary focus and concern of President Biden's foreign policy team, despite the Ukraine crisis. But of course, the U.S. is in a difficult position. You've got Russia has invaded a sovereign nation, is waging a war of aggression against its Western neighbor, and so the U.S. I think quite rightly is piling on the pressure to I think it's important that the violation of this norm be that it exact a very high price. I mean, this is the bedrock norm of the international system, and I think it needs to be treated with that sort of seriousness. But that has put the U.S. in the position of being of waging economic war against Russia at the same time that it views China as the greatest threat to American preeminence. And so, I think that if you're talking about U.S.-China relations more broadly, I mean, there are two sides to this, and both sides have contributed to this sort of downward spiral of relations. The Chinese have become very belligerent, in sort of asserting maritime claims in the South China Sea, have become much more sort of outwardly hostile to the Western democracies and to U.S. influence more generally, much more critical of American actions around the world. As China has become more powerful, it has stopped biting its tongue in response to Western criticisms and has become a lot more vocal and sort of asserting its interests on the world stage. And I think really sort of sending the message that it will not be talked down to by Western powers that it views as having once sort of subjugated China in the 19th century and so forth. So there's been a certain ratcheting up of tension from the Chinese side. I think on the American side, what we see is a crisis a crisis of identity. As the unipolar world that the U.S. Straddled from the end of the Cold War until probably the mid 2010s is coming to an end. What does this mean for U.S. power? In a world where the United States will not be the unchallenged hegemon, what does that mean for the idea of American exceptionalism that underpins American self-perceptions? What does it mean to be American in a world in which American norms do not structure the international system? And I think that the way that this has been processed by the American foreign policy and political establishment has been to depict the challenge posed by China and other powers as well. I mean, the increasing multipolarity of the world system, to sort of frame it as a binary struggle between, worldviews, as a struggle between democracy and liberty and freedom on the one hand, as represented by the United States and its allies, and autocracy and tyranny on the other, as represented by China and other, other governments that are challenging American rule. And I think that I've always been critical of this framing. I think that obviously China, is very authoritarian, and that's, a huge concern for a whole number of reasons within China. It's potentially concerning in terms of the export of technologies to other countries that could facilitate similar types of repression elsewhere. But I think that, China's actions are driven not by some imperative to sort of spread repression around the world. I think that China's actions are driven by fairly rational assessments of its strategic situation, the strategic and security challenges that face it, and a desire to sort of secure both the sort of long-term prosperity, wealth, and power of the Chinese state, and also the domestic position of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think that a lot of the things that China has done, is disruptive and potentially problematic, and as they are, and the extent to which they could contribute to some sort of conflict is very real. But despite all these things, I don't think that they flow from the authoritarian nature of CCP rule within China. I think that they are some things that reflect what I believe any Chinese government would be concerned with. Control over sea lanes of communication, control over China's coastline, and concern about securing its long-term supply of energy. Breaking the stranglehold of the Strait of Malacca. I mean, these are all fairly ideologically neutral strategic concerns that I think any self-respecting Chinese government would, whether that was a democratic government or an authoritarian one, would be concerned with. And I think that, one of the dangers of this sort of ideological framing from the standpoint of the West is that it might actually bring about the very thing that it seeks to forestall, which is that it, and I think this has happened already to an extent. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party does view Western democracy as a threat. But part of the reason it does is because, Western democracy promotion in the unipolar era has, was so self-confident and many places very aggressive. I mean, we saw the toppling of governments in the Middle East, precisely on the pretext of spreading democracy and freedom. And I think for a lot of countries, not just China, this this armed missionary sort of project, and the rhetoric that's accompanied that, is quite rationally seen as a threat. And I think that the more that we go down this path, the more that the Chinese and the Russians and other non-democratic governments around the world, particularly adversaries of the United States, will begin to see a shared interest in shoring up authoritarian rule as such, and a shared interest in exporting authoritarian forms of rule and undermining democracies. And I think that we need to shy away from this framing for precisely that reason. I mean, it could bring about the very thing that, countries like China and Russia could begin to see a shared interest in an authoritarian internationalism, which is something that I don't think that they have a particular interest in, all things being equal. And so I think that, the beginning point, is the unipolar era, the delusions of Western supremacy, and also the idea that Western notions of freedom could be universalized through pressure, economic sanction, and in extremis armed conquest, as we saw in Iraq. So I think that a lot of what we see from the Chinese government in terms of its sort of concerns about Western democracy and constant criticisms of that is sort of a reaction to this sort of period of hubris that followed the end of the Cold War. There's a bit of a vestigial sort of desire as well to sort of prove that, Chinese communism is superior, but I don't think that there's any real desire to export that system. There's no missionary impulse anymore in the way that the Chinese Communist Party views its political system. I think it's about, offering countries the freedom to take their own path, however repressive that might be. And that's a very mixed bag, obviously, as well. That's how I view it. I think that, Western policies, I think needs to rapidly recalibrate and become much more realistic about the, perceptions, in the rest of the world. I mean, the Western countries, as we've seen in Ukraine, have lined up, established this very admirably, united front against Russia. But in much of the developing world, from India to sort of sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, countries are more ambivalent and are refraining from taking such a hard line.
As much as we can talk about the vulnerability of foreign policy from the Western side, Sebastian, I have to be honest with you that not too long ago, I talked to another international expert on this China policy. Based on this person's perspective, that it says, actually, on this China sovereignty side, it shows also its internal vulnerability. So in other words, the reason why China is so actively engaging with the international community, countries in Southeast Asia, countries in Latin America, it's all because China sees this slow growth, despite what we are seeing right now, or what the other people are saying, this economic growth. But internally speaking, China is also facing this unpredictable or this uncertainty politically and socially. And meanwhile, again, this is a country hosts 1.4 billion people, and it's rather difficult to be a leader, or even just to guarantee that everyone can be satisfied or everyone can be happy under this regime or under this leadership. Now, from your perspective, do you think that China shows this uncertainty, or especially turn this economic or political shifts?
But I do think that the Chinese leadership faces a huge amount of domestic problems. For everything from food security to regime security to the influence of ideas from the outside to labor unrest. I mean, poverty alleviation. Its legitimacy is based on rapid economic development and a sort of nationalist credential of sort of defending China's sort of legitimate rights on the world stage. And my fear, of course, is that as the domestic context becomes less hospitable for the current Chinese government, its international behavior, it runs the risk of becoming more belligerent, and is sort of a way of distracting from that. But I'm not a specialist enough about, the specific challenges to really be able to assess, like, the extent to which they're a problem currently. But needless to say, any nation of 1.4 billion people is going to be a hugely challenging thing to hold together. And I wouldn't underestimate the challenges facing the CCP in the medium to long term.
Sebastian, let's talk about one of the important and critical countries in Southeast Asia, which is the Philippines. And if I'm not mistaken, the Philippines is also gearing up for the national election, and which is very critical important. And so far, correct me if I'm wrong, Rodriguez Duterte has not said openly regarding participating in this election. So in other words, he's still holding this hesitant attitude. But meanwhile, we see this relationship, bilateral ties between China and the Philippines. Oh boy. Again, going back to the stage is hot and cold. So it was hot before, but it's cold. Right now, it's cold, might be hot later on. So from your perspective, and I know you mentioned in your book, how important it is for Chinese to pay attention this election happens in the Philippines, and also go back to the question, why does China play a significant role for this election?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that, the baseline sort of alignment within the Philippines security and policymaking establishment is its alliance with the United States and a close relationship with the United States. Duterte, in some ways marked, a departure from that. That's not to say that the Philippines has always had bad relationships with China, quite the opposite, in fact. But Duterte, at a period of tension in the South China Sea, he, for a variety of motivations, some of which are personal, some institutional, decided to embrace, to try and work with China instead of against it. The idea would be that if he sort of downplayed the legal victory that the Philippines won at the International Court of Justice and not the International Court of Justice, the Arbitral Tribunal, if he downplayed that ruling, that victory, and sort of downplayed the tensions in the South China Sea, he could benefit from the Belt and Road Initiative and Chinese infrastructure funding, which was important for his domestic agenda. He also had a lot of resentments against the United States that drew from a long tradition of anti-Americanism, a minority tradition of anti-Americanism, it must be said, within, Philippine political history. And so, this led to sort of a surprising turn toward China, which is, again, sort of, and concern in the United States about the future of the alliance. He threatened to cancel the visiting forces agreement, which governs the actions and sort of the deployment of American troops within the Philippines. And canceling that would have sort of, taken the operating system of sort of American troop deployments in the Philippines off the table, and it would have made it very hard for the U.S. to sort of, it would have threatened security cooperation between the two nations. And in the end, he backed down from that. But I think that what we're likely to see in this election is whoever wins, we're likely to see a reorientation toward the United States and sort of a reaffirmation of the alliance. The one exception, I suppose, and there's a little bit of a question mark about it, is the front runner, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who is sort of a loose successor to Duterte in the sense that his daughter is running with him. Duterte's daughter is running with Marcos as his vice president. And, even though Duterte hasn't, formally endorsed anybody, it can be assumed that, the sort of, his family has long had a relationship with the Marcoses and a political alliance that dates back to his days as the mayor of Davao City in the southern Philippines. So this is a long-standing relationship. One could assume that Marcos is about the closest thing that there would be to sort of a second Duterte term. And some comments that Marcos made seem to suggest that he would continue Duterte's sort of softer position on China. But there are questions. That's a very unpopular position within the Philippines in terms of opinion polls. It's the one area in which Duterte is being Duterte's policies have been unpopular. His stance toward China, and so we don't know if Marcos actually wins, which he's projected to do, whether he will actually take that policy or whether he'll do something more politically astute, which is to sort of tack back toward the U.S. alliance. So, yeah, I mean, I think that, China's playing an important role, but most of the candidates that are running have sort of nailed their colors to the U.S. mast and are fairly committed to, a revival of the treaty relationship with the United States. And I think that's probably most likely what we'll see. But as I said, Marcos is a bit of an unknown, and we'll have to wait to see, how things pan out on that front if he does win.
Sebastian, this year actually comes up with the 10-year anniversary for Belt and Road Initiative. And within this international community, a lot of experts are saying that countries in Southeast Asia, as we mentioned before, the Philippines and Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, etc., these countries are actually looking forward to further their partnership in terms of political ties and economic partnership, all these agendas with China. Given this condition that China, under this Belt and Road Initiative, it's actually implementing a lot more projects, not only domestically, but also internationally. I'm sure that you are mindful, but for example, China invested so much in the countries of Laos, and they built a railway, so right now you can actually travel from one cities in China to Laos all the way. And of course, it's 100% paid by the Chinese government. But meanwhile, that really put a lot more countries in Southeast Asia under a tremendous pressure because they don't want to be played by China. But meanwhile, they know they cannot stay too far away from this country. So in this year, Sebastian, again, I'm sure you also mentioned in your book, how do you think that countries such as Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, these countries should balance their relationship with China this year? And should they just be, I don't want to use the word patronizing, or they should keep this positive and friendly, but meanwhile, they know how to keep a distance in order to avoid greater a conflict or, economic unpredictability? What do you think?
Well, every nation in Southeast Asia, approaches China in a slightly different way. Every nation has experienced Chinese power and interacted with the various Chinese states and empires in different ways, and there are a lot of variables. I mean, geographic proximity to China, whether you share a border with it, is a big determinant.
Right.
The extent to which nationalism has an anti-Chinese cast, as it does in some nations, but in others does not, is another important variable. The extent to which a country is democratic also matters, to the extent that nations that are more authoritarian, tend, the governments tend not to be responsive to the public, and they are basically looking out for foreign alignments that can, ensure their regime survives over the medium to long term. And so all of these things play into how the various nations of Southeast Asia have managed to set their relations with China. I think that the main thing is to sort of continue to benefit from the economic relationships that exist. I mean, China is the leading trade partner of virtually every nation in Southeast Asia now, is an increasingly important source of foreign direct investment, especially large-scale hard infrastructure investments. And this, of course, predates the Belt and Road. I mean, a lot of these projects have been rebranded as part of the Belt and Road.
Right.
But really, in a lot of places, China was already doing a lot of this stuff. And how to benefit from all of those sorts of initiatives, from the huge amount of trade and all of that, which China really is central to the future economic prosperity of Southeast Asia fundamentally, while also sort of preventing themselves from being sucked into sort of a Chinese orbit, a new Chinese imperium, and sort of maintain a healthy diversity of foreign alignments. And it's every nation, that challenge exists at different pitches of tension for every nation. I mean, those nations that directly border China have always faced a much more have always, tended to have a lot more anxiety about what a powerful China will mean. I mean, the Vietnamese are of course the prime example here. They live in, exist in a state of incredible tension. Also, which is laced, of course, with this irony that Vietnam and China have also been so close to one another in many ways, and that the Vietnamese have borrowed so much from Chinese civilization that the two, there's a certain commonality that underpins this intense sense of difference there. But for the nation, then there's small nations like Cambodia and Laos, which have traditionally feared not China, but the nations to either side. So the Cambodians have feared the Vietnamese, and to a certain extent the Thais. And so good relations with a large outside power like China make quite a bit of sense. The fact that there are large numbers of ethnic Chinese that migrated to Cambodia, mostly under the French colonial period, has also created a sort of sense of kinship amongst many Sino-Cambodians, and there's not just the level of anti-Chinese sentiment in Cambodia is relatively low. So this has created a sort of hospitable environment for an extension of relations with China. Add on to that the question of regime security and Western democracy promotion efforts, and you can understand why Cambodia's relationship with China is so close. But yeah, when you get out to nations like Indonesia and the Philippines, you're moving sort of you're moving further away in geographic terms, and the concern in both of these places tends to be more maritime tensions. But in the case of Indonesia, particularly the domestic position of ethnic Chinese populations within the country. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that each nation will have to strike this balance in its own way.
That's right.
Each nation's domestic politics will filter the question of relations with China in different ways. In each country, it'll be perceived in different ways, and I think that it's very hard to sort of say that there's one thing that all of these nations should do, except to sort of say that they should strive for balance in their foreign relations. They don't want to be too dependent on China, and this, of course, is why the region has tended to resist sort of any attempt to kind of enlist it into an anti-Chinese coalition of some kind, or that basically. It does not want to see the region repolarize as it did during the Cold War. I mean, there's no reason from the Southeast Asian perspective why nations can't have good security relationships with the United States and also fruitful economic ties to China. And I think that what this region really wants, and the Singaporeans have been very good at expressing this, is for the Chinese and the Americans to come up with some sort of accommodation, and to sort of to sort of damp down these tensions, to quell these tensions, and to try and work out some sort of way of accommodating one another. I mean, I don't think that's likely to happen. But you see, the Singaporeans have been quite good at directing criticisms in both directions.
That's right.
And I think that they've been very critical of the Chinese leadership for sort of asserting its military power in disputed maritime regions. They've also been very critical of the way that the Americans have has sort of, sought to, frame this in ideological terms, which sort of presumes a kind of, it almost presumes a sort of showdown of some point. Incompatible values can never sort of be reconciled with one another. And I think, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong has been quite eloquent in articulating sort of what I would take to be a sort of Southeast Asian position on the way that this Sino-American tension is playing out. But I think there's a lot of other powers in the region as well. The Japanese play a very important role in sort of offering an alternative to China without sort of falling too much into that ideological framing. They're very much more pragmatic in the way that they deal with, like the Cambodians, for instance, than the Western Europeans and Americans are. And then you have, other economic powers. Russia is important in the region, mostly in terms of arms sales, but it also has, older relationships that go back to the Cold War that are still, that still bind to a large extent. South Korea, Australia, the European Union is an economic presence in the region, if less a strategic one. And I think that, what nations should really be doing is sort of doing what the Vietnamese do, which is having this omnidirectional foreign policy that seeks to be friends with everybody and enemies of none. And I think that's, that's, unfortunately, though, a lot of what will determine what happens in Southeast Asia will probably not it probably lies beyond the region. I mean, it's decisions that are made in Beijing, Washington, Brussels, London, Canberra, Tokyo that will have a huge impact on how the region develops.
Right.
And so it's, there's only so much it can do. One other point I would make is that the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, should try to become a lot more proactive in sort of safeguarding and asserting its strategic interests. And I think that's of course, there's structural challenges to that. ASEAN has got sort of a consensus-based decision-making model, which allows any particular nation within it to essentially veto a course of action. But, the crisis in Myanmar has sort of revealed that it's revealed ASEAN's shortcomings. I think it's probably high time for ASEAN to retool itself for a world of multipolarity and renewed superpower tension. I think, the period of the sort of unipolar moment when ASEAN was basically a forum for economic tweaking and sort of economic integration. That era has sort of come to an end, and it needs to start facing the sort of more dangerous world that has come into being in the last sort of decade. And that's something else that the nations of Southeast Asia should invest a lot of energy in trying to work out.
Well, Sebastian, I want to end our conversation by going back to your book. And your book is called In the Dragon's Shadow, Southeast Asia in the Chinese Century. Again, as I mentioned before, after thoroughly reading your book, and not only that, I want to use the word educational, but also I think the bigger one, it's called eye-opening. I mean, in the book, you actually documented or you researched specific on so many countries that we just talked about before. So I do want to encourage our listeners, our viewers, to grab a copy of Sebastian's new book because it's a very enlightening, it's a very educational in many ways. If you want to study the power of China in terms of political and social shift in Southeast Asia. But the question to you, Sebastian, is your book is entitled In the Chinese Century. So I still want to ask, do you think in the year of 2022, or even let's say the upcoming 4 to 5 years, would you still believe this will be or continue to be the Chinese century? If so, how would you define, or what is the meaning of Chinese century? Because given the condition or given the fact, China has never officially claimed that we are the ruler of the world, and we never want to take over any other countries or become the superpower of the world. Because in the Chinese culture, we believe humility, and we believe, try to how can I say, to minimize myself in order to maximize, others. But this is such a bold statement in the Chinese century. So going back to the question, would you believe this still the Chinese century? If so, how would you define it?
Well, I mean, nowhere in my book do I sort of mount an argument that it will be the Chinese century. I use that sort of in a fairly loose sense in the subtitle of the book. But I do think that, China will be the dominant challenge for the nations of Southeast Asia in the coming 78 years. I mean, this is an epical shift in the balance of power in East and Southeast Asia. A return, to, or arguably a closing of a 5-century period of Western preeminence that began with, the Portuguese conquests of the 16th century. And I think that, I think that China will remain the dominant power in this region, and how the Southeast Asian nations handle it will be their cardinal foreign policy challenge for the next couple of generations. That's more or less what I mean by it. I mean, I do think that in many senses, the coming century, we want a multipolarity, increasing multipolarity, both globally and in Southeast Asia. But I think that for Southeast Asian nations, the dominant pole will be China. Now, of course, there are many things that could disrupt that. But that's how it looks at the moment. And even if China's economic growth slows considerably, it's still going to be a very, important presence in the region, and not unchallenged, of course, but like I said, will certainly be the prime challenge that most of these